Utah voters choose more than candidates on Election Day. Their votes also impact how the state deals with the issues it faces. Much of that work happens in the Utah legislature. We'll look at issues and some legislative races voters will decide when they cast their ballots this election season. Hello, I'm Wes Sims, News Director for KBYU-FM. On this Election 2010 special, we're looking at Utah issues with an eye toward candidates running in state legislative races. And we're considering how candidates use those issues in their campaign. On today's program, to consider the topic, are Dean David Magleby, founder of the BYU Center for the Study of Elections and Democracy.
Good to be here.
Good to be with you, David. LaVar Webb is founder of the Exoro Group, a Salt Lake City consulting firm in communications, a political strategy group. He has also served as former policy director for former Governor Mike Leavitt. And,
nice to be
LaVar,
here.
welcome you first. And Pat Shea is the third member of our panel here. Pat Shea is a University of Utah faculty member, a past Clinton administration appointee. He was also a candidate for the governor's office and for the United States Senate seat for Utah. Gentlemen, welcome to the three of you. David, I know the Center for the Study of Elections and Democracy has conducted a poll of voters' interest, and you find that 60% of registered voters say they're really following this election cycle and quite interested.
Well, the intensity that we're seeing across the country, in areas especially where the Tea Party has been active and strong, is carrying over here into Utah. I think it's fair to say that it's a midterm cycle. It will not be as much interest in Utah as you would see in a typical presidential cycle. But for a midterm cycle, given Utah's conservatism and Republican orientation, I think we're seeing a lot of interest, and I think that'll likely carry over to November 2nd.
How does this measure up historically, or is it unique this year because of the interest of the Tea Party?
Well, I think there are movements within parties, and so that this is not unusual in the sense that some activists are quite involved. I think what is unusual is the extent to which this particular group has been successful in pushing their agenda and their nominees into the general election. In state after state, Wes, we're seeing nominees that were not the chosen nominees of the party leaders. It's not just Utah, where Bob Bennett did not make it into the general election. It's Kentucky, it's Delaware, where Mitch McConnell and others at the National Republican Senatorial Committee had courted and groomed candidates to run for the Senate. Those candidates have been defeated by Tea Party upstarts.
And we're going to talk more about the Tea Party as we go along here. Another question on the KBYU Utah voter poll survey asked people to rank what Utah issues they thought were most important this election season. And we're seeing them on the screen right now. Economy and jobs, number one. Education, immigration, health care, the state budget. Well, experts say that the recession is over, but a lot of people are still out of work, and Utahns see the economy as one of the most urgent issues facing the state.
And the interesting contrast, Wes, is that this is an issue that is very much hurting the Democrats nationally, where they've been in charge for 2 years, but it is apparently not hurting the Republicans within Utah. That's an interesting juxtaposition that says really the president and his party gets the credit or the blame.
That always seems to be the case, doesn't it? Well, generally our society tends to address issues facing the state through the legislature. And the KBYU Utah voter poll asked Utahns how they thought they would vote in state legislative elections, and most said that they would support Republican candidates.
What these data show, I think, is a pretty clear mirror of the party identification distribution within Utah. What you're really seeing here, 80 or 90% of, is people's underlying party preference. 60-30, that's about the party split in Utah.
Pat Shea, let's talk about the wave of change election we've been talking about. You've been a candidate running as a Democrat. How do you work to convince voters to try something new, especially in Utah, where the predilection is to support Republicans?
If you follow common wisdom, it strikes me that you spend more money. And since we've had a Supreme Court decision that has loosened the spigot of corporate giving, you're seeing an unprecedented amount of money coming in. And certainly the Democrats have attempted to match that Utah certainly doesn't appear on the radar screen for the National Democratic Party. They've been helpful to Mayor Caroon because I think they saw a person with good integrity and somebody who will probably run again. But I think you also go back to basics, and that is get out the vote. GOTV is the most important part of a Democratic campaign in the state of Utah, and I think some of the legislative races we're talking about will be decided by the candidate who gets the most votes out.
LaVar, Webb, you support the Republican candidates. How does an incumbent defend against a frustrated electorate, or are Republican incumbents immune from what we're seeing overall nationally?
I do think that that voters are viewing local candidates and national candidates somewhat differently. And unfortunately for the Democrats, the Democrats are getting the blame for the economy. They're focused at the national level, and local Republican candidates do not seem to be getting that kind of blame. I think that Utah Republicans are kind of wrapping the economy and the bad economy and that anger into the big government programs of the Obama administration, and they see the national deficit skyrocketing. And so that, combined with the concern about the economy and the loss of jobs and the uncertainty that people feel, they have really directed that anger toward the national Democrats, but not toward the Republicans who have really run Utah for many years. And I would say in defense of the Republicans in Utah, we do have a well-managed state. We balance our budgets, and so people seem to be pretty happy with the way state government is being run in Utah.
Well, let's consider the first of those issues that Utahns were most concerned about this year. The weak economy has two candidates in a state Senate race looking at very different circumstances. Election 2010's Jake Taylor prepared this report.
In this climate, issues of taxes and the economy are going to be a big deal when Utahns step into the voting booth. As voters go to the poll in November, economic worries are certainly going to be on their minds.
I think a lot of people are very concerned about spending and the increase in debt that's happening, not just back in Washington, D.C., but sometimes right here in our own backyard.
For an example of how the economy may affect voting, consider the upcoming Senate District 9 race between Wayne Niederauser and Tyler Ayers. The difference between the two is stark when it comes to economic philosophy.
My position is limited government, low taxes, grow the economy.
We need to put the people first. We need to address the needs of the people, and we need to do so in the most effective and efficient way. Unfortunately, I don't believe the Utah State Legislature is doing that right now.
They each have different plans when it comes to what Utah needs to do to improve its economy.
Incentivizing business that creates that revenue, business expanding creates more revenue, and that's how I feel we're going to create prosperity.
What I'm advocating is a mind change. Rather than focusing on big business and supporting big business, I think that we as a government need to focus on the people.
If past elections show us anything, it's that voters vote according to their pocketbooks. Jake Taylor, Election 2010.
Well, the KBYU Utah voter poll taken this month asked people how they were feeling about the state of their personal finances compared with how things were a year ago during the worst of the recession. And about a third of them said that they were even worse off, while about half said that things were just about as bad this year as they were a year ago. David Magleby, you think those numbers give any candidate pause to think about why he or she is running for office?
Yeah, it does make you wonder. I think that these kinds of feelings linger for a while, and it's going to, just as we're seeing with consumer confidence data, it's going to take a while, I think, for people's attitudes to change, and that's going to be predicated upon economic change, which hasn't really ramped up much yet, and so that is not a surprising result from the poll. I think the interesting question is so what? Is it going to change how people see what we do in Utah, where we do balance our budgets, as LaVar said earlier, by constitutional requirement, but have very pressing needs in education and many other areas that we'll be talking about in this program. And there's not much room for more additional cutting, and the stimulus money is likely not going to come again, even though Utah was perfectly happy to take it. So what will the state do if the economy doesn't turn around? And that, I think, will be a real challenge as we go forward.
LaVar, Webb, you advise a great many Republican candidates. How do you advise them to talk about the economy?
Well, clearly the economy is the big issue, and I think Senator Niederhauser actually responded the way lots of Republicans respond, that we need to stimulate business, that we need to grow the economy. If we grow the economy, we will have more money for schools and for social services and for the needs of the state. And and that, I think people respond well to that. Tax increases are the worst thing you could possibly talk about in this environment. Neither Republicans or Democrats are really talking about tax increases. So it really is about stimulating the environment, increasing jobs, and raising more revenue through those means.
But then when you talk about deficits, tax revenue is what's really necessary to make up the deficits.
That's right. But again, the answer that Republicans would give is that we need to grow the economy, and that will help us overcome those deficits. At the national level, back in Bill Clinton's time when the budget was balanced, it was in part, in large measure, it was because we had a booming economy.
Mm-hmm. Pat Shea, during this recessionary time, I'm just wondering why this hasn't sparked more political fuel for Democrats.
I think David hit upon a very important point. We have been, since 9/11, in a state of perpetual fear, and the right wing, in my judgment, has caused more yelling, more screaming, more fear-mongering than any other time in my 62 years of life. And I think it has spilled over into an inability to have a constructive dialogue. I've watched on the Charlie Rose show, for instance, several economists, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, say this is a very complex question. And I fear that the 30-second sound bites that have replaced political dialogue have made it so that intelligent people, one, don't want to run for office, or two, if they do run for office and try to give a complex answer to complex questions, they get shouted down by people who don't know what they're talking about.
David, did you have a question?
Well, I just think, I'm thinking about LaVar's comment, and it is a time when people don't propose tax increases. Utah's tax rate was previously much more progressive than it is presently. Why isn't that on the agenda? It's a little bit like the federal level, where the extension of the Bush tax cuts has prompted the notion of raising taxes, but only on people with income over $250,000. Why not raise taxes on Utahns earning more than $250,000 and put those funds directly to education?
If you do ask people if would they be willing to have their taxes raised specifically for education, for a specific education purpose, then historically people have said, yes, I would like to do that. However, if politicians actually respond and raise taxes, then the history shows that they get punished in an election. So there is no appetite in Utah at virtually any level of government to raise taxes. And you won't see the governor proposing tax increases. You won't see legislators proposing tax increases. I do think, I do think that it causes problems with education. Our education is underfunded, and we need to do better. But I do think the answer is to grow the economy, bring in more tax revenue. You know, we had many years when we had hundreds of millions of dollars of tax surplus. In fact, we gave a lot of that money back in tax rebates and tax cuts. And if we can get back to those years, then we will be able to treat education a lot better.
Well, education is the second most pressing issue listed on the latest KBYU Utah voter poll. And reporter Kelly Barker looks at the District 11 state Senate race in terms of the issue of education.
The U.S. Census Bureau reports Utah spent under $6,000 per student compared to the national average of over $10,000. State Senate candidate and former state representative Dave Hogue says it is time to end this tradition of education funding.
This past year, we had 25,000 new students come into the school system and we didn't fund. Now, I think it's great that the governor says well, we held education harmless, but they really didn't. They really cut education.
Utah's high birth rate and large areas of land exempt from the property taxes used to fund education compound the problem. State Senator Howard Stevenson sits on several education-related committees in the legislature. He says for the state to use its limited education funds more effectively, teachers must be held accountable. One way to do that, he says, is to issue report cards for schools.
If grading is good enough for our kids, I think it's good enough for schools.
Last week, gubernatorial candidate Peter Caroon challenged Governor Herbert and the legislature to accept over $100 million of federal funding for education. Hogue says he agrees with Democrats who say even in a recession, education needs to be top priority, pointing out the Utah legislature cut $10 million in education last year.
Don't even delay. We should take that $101 million right now and get it out to the kids, get it into the classrooms where we can teach kids.
But Republicans disagree, saying taking this money is unconstitutional.
I think federal money in any form is like crack cocaine. There has to come a time when we say no to federal money.
Carly Barker, Election 2010.
Dave Hogue spent 10 years in the legislature as a Republican. Do his arguments fall on deaf ears now because he's become a Democrat?
Well, I think we live in a state where there's a very strong cultural tradition based on religious beliefs, and that's very important for the well-being of the state. What we don't do is separate out politics from religion, and I think sometimes when people are labeled as a Democrat, then they're not accepted within the mainstream of the political motivation going on. I find it amazing that a friend of mine has a wife who teaches at Dilworth Elementary School, my elementary school in Salt Lake City. She is supposed to have 20 students. She has 31. She spends well over $2,000 a year on buying additional materials. And we seem to have this false pride that we do more with less and that we ought to remain 52nd. We're behind Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia in what we spend per capita in the students. We spend 3 times as much money in prison. Costs $25,000, actually 5 times, $25,000 a year to keep a prisoner in minimum or medium security, and we spend $5,000 on students. Something is wrong when people who are normally willing to listen to facts can't see that.
Let's pick up on that strain. I'm going to ask LaVar to respond, but I'll say with you, Pat, Utahns pay federal taxes, so why shouldn't Utah accept federal money back for education?
Well, I'll let LaVar answer that quick. My answer is,
well, why should they? I'll ask you why they should.
Well, because we need to improve our educational system. We are in a global economy. Governor Huntsman, now Ambassador Huntsman, has said several times what the Chinese are doing with their K through 12 and more importantly their higher education is going to place them so far ahead of us. When I was at Dilworth Elementary School through Stanford University, we were #1 in physics, we were #1 in science, we were #1 in math. We're now 37 and 38th on those subjects because we haven't been willing to pay the educational price that are needed in these times.
I see LaVar champing at the bit here. So why should not Utah accept federal funding?
I think we should accept that federal money. I don't agree with Senator Stevenson that there ought to be a blanket refusal to accept all federal money. We take federal money in highways and social services and in a wide range of things. We do pay the taxes, and so we deserve to get back our fair share of those taxes. And if we reject that federal money, it's not going to reduce the federal deficit. It's just going to go somewhere else. However, I would say that I would much prefer that we pay less in federal taxes, keep more of the taxes at the state level, and then we would not have to have that money run through the federal bureaucracy and then come back to Utah. So let's keep it here, reduce our federal taxes. I do think that we need to spend more money on education. I think that Republicans agree that education is absolute to top priority, that we're not doing as well as we should, that we do need to compete internationally. I do think that Republicans would be more supportive of funding for public schools if they did see some reforms with teacher accountability and some of those things, but education is a top priority for Republicans.
I noticed that neither candidate, but especially Senator Stevenson, did not mention vouchers. The voters overwhelmingly rejected that idea. So now we have report cards for teachers, but that doesn't really address the compensation issue or the classroom size issue. I don't think anybody doubts that we need accountability. The issue here is a core issue of basic funding. And can't we all agree that Utah is well below a threshold of basic funding?
We can agree with that, but to bring Utah up to the level even average in the country for class size and teacher pay and so forth would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And I just don't think the voters of Utah, the citizens of Utah, or the political establishment is willing to raise taxes that much.
Does that mean, in your view, that the state voters at least want it both ways? They want to continue to have large families, but they don't want to pay for those children's education?
Certainly, to some extent, that's true. Higher taxes are a non-starter at this time in our political culture and so forth.
Pat?
I think LaVar needs to recognize that if we raise the tax on the top less than 1%, actually it's a half a percentage point, just 2%, we could cover the cost necessary to increase public education funding. I'm not talking about higher ed, just talking about public education. And to have a person who's making millions of dollars paying as few dollars as he does in Utah, or she does in Utah, is inexcusable.
Let's move on to the other issues we're covering. It's probably the most emotional issue before Utahns, but comes in third in our KBYU Utah voter poll list of top election issues. If you say illegal immigration, you've touched a nerve with a majority in Utah. In fact, the KBYU Utah voter poll shows a wide majority favor an Arizona-style illegal immigration law that would punish non-documented aliens for just being in the state. David, there don't seem to be any neutral areas in this.
It's a highly emotional issue, and one that is easy to exploit, I think, politically. And I think we're seeing that in Utah, and I think we're seeing that nationally. What's fascinating to me about the dynamics of Utah is religious faiths, not just the Latter-day Saints, but Catholics and others, have been quite outspoken about this relative to other issues upon which they sometimes don't speak very much. And despite that, these numbers that were up on the screen a moment ago seem to reflect a pretty strong underlying tendency that the Arizona-style approach, which I would define as rather substantial compared to what other states have done, and which has generated a lot of negative publicity for Arizona, perhaps some positive as well, remains positive here, even though there's been an effort to sort of generate calmness and civility in the dialogue, and who knows what civility means for sure, but I think that may mean greater tolerance. And certainly the Latino population in Utah has spoken out strongly against the Arizona-style approach. So these figures, to me, suggest the Utah public is not all that different than other publics, and some elite statements have not moved mass voters yet.
Well, let's go to another one of our reports. Brittany Glass reports now on the illegal immigration issue and the race in House District 58. That's where the incumbent looks to define himself with a pattern first set in Arizona.
What do we want? Freedom! What do we want it?
Some 130,000 illegal immigrants live in Utah. Voters choosing among candidates in state legislative races will be electing representatives who will confront the illegal immigration issue in January when the legislature convenes. Representative Stephen Sandstrom plans to offer a bill targeting illegal immigrants.
If we can solve the illegal immigration problem in this country, crack down on them, have them self-deport, get a secure border, then that can open the door for opportunities for people from all over the world to come here.
Those who support Sandstrom's new immigration bill say Utah has no other option.
Look at the amount of money that we're currently spending on emergency bursts of illegal aliens, on food stamps, the other problems. How are we going to pay for that?
However, on the opposite side of the debate, people say that immigration is not a state's right and that trying to change it locally simply won't work.
What the states are trying to do with this patchwork quilt of different laws is going to be so confusing.
Others say state immigration laws like Sandstrom's discriminate.
As just one component of, for human rights.
Even so, Sandstrom justifies his bill.
It really is an issue of pro-immigrant to crack down on illegal immigration.
Sandstrom's opponent isn't focusing on immigration because he says Utahns believe there are more important issues at hand this election.
Education, job creation, economy, and legislative ethics are the most key issues.
Despite the battle over Sandstrom's seat in the Utah House and mixed views over what to do about immigration, Governor Gary Herbert is optimistic for a positive outcome.
We'll find a Utah solution to this issue, and I expect that the legislature will come together.
Brittany Glass, Election 2010.
LaVar, Webb, just what is a Utah solution for the question of immigration? Is it Arizona? Is it our own? Is it a hybrid? What is it?
I think there's a chance that something like the Arizona bill will pass here. I think it may be watered down some so it's not quite as strict. But there's also a lot of momentum from the Chamber of Commerce, interestingly, from some very conservative legislators like Senator Stevenson that we had on before, to pass a bill also that would allow workers to stay in Utah. They would have to be registered and have documentation and so forth, and that's what Governor Herbert is talking about, is a compromise, and even the chamber and the governor are saying that we could even be a model for the country in how we resolve this issue.
Pat Shea, how does the Democrat find traction on this issue? It seems that there are so many people who want punitive responses to the immigration issue.
Personally, I think we go back to what the Founding Fathers did in 1789. The Articles of Confederation that glorified state rights didn't work, wouldn't work today. So I think we have to have a Congress that will do a national program so that we don't have this quilt of crazy laws that are in conflict with one another, and the immigrants will move from one state to the other state. Now, I do want to make it perfectly clear, I don't think we should let any Irish in. I think there's plenty of other people that deserve to come in, but the Irish have caused too many problems. But on the other hand, I do think having a guest worker permit, which President George W. Bush proposed, would make sense. But again, these fearmongers have made it so impossible for elected public officials to stand up and say, we are going to do this on the national level. We need some profiles and courage. We need some people who will stand up like Cal Rampton or Scott Matheson or Norm Bangerter and say, this is what we're going to do because it's the right thing to do. But everything that I see coming out of Washington these days, and I think this is true for Republicans and Democrats alike, is, have you seen my latest 30-second commercial? Have you seen my latest donation letter? It's not about substantive policy. And if we get back to that, where people are there to make the right decisions, not for re-election, but for good public policy, then we'll have a national policy.
I'd like to ask you, could I jump in here, Wes, and ask? I'd like to ask you a question that takes us back to 1964 and Goldwater's vote on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which became a defining moment for African Americans and partisanship. Up until that point, the Party of Emancipation, the Republican Party, had done well with Republicans. That changed in a fairly dramatic way. Don't the Republicans in Utah and in other states run a substantial risk of permanently alienating Hispanic voters? And that's a growing constituency in Utah and places like Colorado and Nevada and California, which are all battlegrounds all around us this year, where the Latino vote may well determine the outcome. Isn't there a danger to this Republican strategy in Arizona and in Utah of taking the lead on the immigration issue?
There certainly is, especially over the long term. I don't know that there will be a big impact in this particular election, and politicians tend to view life fairly short term. But over the long term, the Latino population is going to grow, and if Republicans alienate the Hispanics, then they will pay for it in the polls over the long term. I absolutely agree with Pat that immigration is a national issue. It needs to be resolved at that level, but because the federal government has not acted, does not seem willing to act, then states are being pushed by their people to do things. But I do think that some states could step up and do the right thing, and it will be a combination of cracking down where it's appropriate, but also providing guest worker permits and so forth, and perhaps that could lead to a national solution.
But David, I just want to be a quick answer to your question. When a CEO is looking at where she might move her plant or her operation, Arizona and Utah are not going to rate high, in large part because of the right wing's yelling about immigration. Those people, meaning immigrants, legal and illegal, are very important parts of our workforce, agricultural work, for instance, or manufacturing work. And so I think we are truly shooting ourselves in the foot by being at the cutting edge of this important issue. We ought to be responsible and do the right federal thing.
Let me follow up, if I could, with the Deseret News reporting. LaVar's old newspaper had a series on immigration, rather bold series, which in essence was a set of fact-checking articles on many of the things that are, including in our piece, are frequently spread around about crime rates and other kinds of things, and substantially debunked many of the arguments that are being given for this push on immigration. First, I thought it was interesting that Deseret News did the series. It seems that it may not have had any effect given the polling data. What's your read on both the series and the impact?
Well, the fact that the Deseret News did that, and they took a lot of work and effort in that series. They had a major editorial that was spread across the front page of the opinion section. The KSL Radio and Television also had a series on it. I think part of what that means is that the LDS Church is concerned about this issue. I think the LDS Church would prefer that Utah come down with a fairly moderate position on immigration. And I would say let's wait and see what comes out of the legislature, because I do think that there is some momentum toward a more moderate position on immigration.
Well, certainly a couple hot-button issues. One is people born in the United States. Historically, you're a citizen if you're born here. Now they're referred to as anchor babies if they're children of illegal immigrants. Does this have any traction, LaVar?
Well, you know, there's a lot of talk about that, but that's going to require a repeal of the 14th Amendment, and that has to go through Congress with a 2/3 vote, and 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. You know, I just don't think it's going to happen.
The other thing, Pat Shea, is the DREAM Act, which would allow children who came here as infants, who maybe didn't even know that they were illegal immigrants until they got into high school, allow them to become citizens, because they're stuck. They're essentially stuck. They can't do anything.
You know, I am working, actually, I befriended a taco vendor, and so I've become an integral part of their family structure, and they're legal and illegal, and there is one in particular who's under the age of 18, and so this very month we're working to make sure that, you know, he gets his citizenship, which he's entitled to since one parent is an American citizen. But when you have fear overtake rationality, you get the reaction. My dear aunt, who I love dearly, about 2 years ago was in bed suffering from a problem, and she said, "Pat, now I'm going to say something that I know you won't like." And I said, "Well, what's that?" And she said, there are too many brown people around." And it's not who she is. It's not what she believes on a personal basis. But when you turn on the television, or you pick up the newspaper, or you even get on the internet, and there's this thing about illegal immigrants and all these other costly problems, I think David's absolutely correct. The Deseret News did a great job as a great newspaper to put the facts out, but we're not having citizens, voters, read those facts.
Let's move on to our other issues. Respondents to the KBYU Utah voter poll survey put health care at number 4 on the list of issues that they're concerned about. Reporter Adam Belinsky found voters in Utah House District 60 have a pretty clear choice between the candidates, at least as far as their stand on the Healthy Americans Act is concerned.
Obamacare is the exact opposite of what we need to do. And so not only does it need to be repealed, but we need to start looking at market-driven solutions.
To talk about repealing it, it strikes me as crazy. I mean, how are you going to tell a family now that, sorry, your kid who was born with a pre-existing condition will now have to not be insured anymore?
So Utah House District 60 candidate Alan Keel says the bill is a step in the right direction, even if it needs some improvement. But incumbent Brad Daw says the act does more harm than good, and specifically will hurt the state legislature's ability to run a good Medicaid program by allowing rich people with low incomes to qualify for help they don't need.
Now, we can't look at any means test. We can't look at any assets that you have. And so a lot of people who really don't need Medicaid are going to qualify, and that may push off people who do need Medicaid.
But Keel says that thinking is just another example of unfounded anti-Obamacare hysteria.
We had Sarah Palin yelling that we were going to have death panels. And so for Mr. Daw to claim that, you know, this is going to cause this terrible problem, that we won't be able to discriminate between people with $10 million who are dipping into the Medicaid fund and so forth, it seems to me is even just as ludicrous as Sarah Palin's claim.
Keel says the more the Act's provisions take effect, the more people will like it. But Daw says people won't like it when they see their health care premiums skyrocket. Adam Belinsky, Election 2010.
Well, President Obama made getting the Healthy Americans Act through Congress his first domestic initiative of his first term. But respondents to our KBYU Utah voter poll were not impressed, if you take his approval rating in Utah as any indication. About 70% disapprove of the president's job in office. David, that total is down from near 80% disapproval we saw during the June primary season, so that would indicate at least that...
Well, let's send a telegram to the president. He could visit Utah now. I think it again mirrors party identification. That this is a variable that is very much reflecting Utah's underlying partisan preferences. I think much more interesting is the dynamics of the race we just saw, and isn't politics wonderful that these candidates go at each other and even find a way to bring in former vice presidential candidates into the conversation. I think candidate Keel makes a point that is very interesting, which is I think it is harder now to repeal it than many may think. And I think as the benefits become more a pattern, he used the example of a child with a pre-existing condition, I think people will resonate to that. It's the old adage in initiative and referendum voting. I think status quo is going to, which is now the health care plan in place, is going to be very hard to upset. And so I think it's shorthand for anti-Obama. I really don't think there's a serious agenda item here on the docket.
Pat, why is health care not more of a bonus for Democrats running in Utah? I mean, it seems like everyone wants improved health care, but as soon as the president put his name on it, it was doomed.
Well, I think the word tricksters in Washington who are paid six-figure or more salaries came up with this Obamacare. And I think if you asked Representative Daw to give you details of what Obamacare meant in fact, out of the several thousand pages in the legislation, he would not be able to do it. I just, on my way down here, stopped at the Intermountain Medical Center, which is an incredible facility, because a friend's boyfriend had fell asleep in a car and had cracked almost 10 ribs. And the doctor was explaining the incredible operation that they were going to do to make it so that they would heal in a way that wouldn't impair him. He's only 31 years old. He's British, so, you know, in England, there would never be a question about him being taken care of. Here, there may be a 2-day delay in his surgery. Fortunately, it's not life-threatening until we find out what insurance rigmarole they have to go through. And so I think most Americans are tired, and I think David's absolutely correct. As the actual process takes hold, because you couldn't do it overnight, you had to spread it out over 2 or 3 years, people are going to say, you know, that's not a bad thing. And it's like the TARP funds. You know, everybody, and Senator Bennett was a victim of it, said, oh, you're giving government money away. And it was a success. It stopped us so far from a depression. And yet, at the time, people were yelling and screaming about it.
Well, Obamacare was kind of borrowed, I think, from during the Clinton years when the First Lady was put in charge of looking into it, and they called it Hillary Care. But let me ask you, LaVar Webb, it is the National Health Care Act. It's the Healthy Americans Act. It's not a proposal. How is the Utah legislature and the governor going to deal with these provisions going into place?
I think they're still trying to figure it out, and there are many provisions of the act that we don't know the impact and exactly how it's going to roll out. I think time will tell whether citizens will accept the benefits or not. There are plenty of national analysts that are bipartisan or nonpartisan who have real concerns, real problems with the National Health Care Act. At the state level, we have been engaging in some health care reform, and now they're trying to figure out, can we continue with state-based health care reform? What can we do and what can't we do within the National Act? I do think that the Republicans will not be able to repeal the act, but they are talking about perhaps defunding it, not passing the funding that would be required to implement some of the provisions. And so we'll see what happens next Tuesday, and if Republicans win, just what they do with the National Health Care Act.
Families are not going to be happy with the things that they don't have anymore, like pre-existing conditions. Are your children on your insurance to the age of 26, and all of a sudden that goes away?
Well, that's true, although some of those provisions are already have been implemented. But a lot of provisions have not. We do absolutely face a health care crisis in the country, and I do think it's incumbent upon Republicans, if they think they have something better, to propose that rather than just oppose the Obama Health Care Act.
If we had political leadership like Mr. Keel, the candidate against Representative Daw, or Mayor Caroon, their approach when there is complicated federal legislation would bring people together. Let's figure out how we can make it work. What instead we have with the legislature, in my judgment, is let's yell at each other and then worry about what's going to not happen.
Well, let's move on here. One issue that we've seen percolating since at least the 2008 election is that of ethics reform. The Utah Department of Transportation recently settled with a contractor for $13 million to forestall any lawsuit that might impede the I-15 reconstruction, the I-15 core project. That ethics, the ethics of that payment, is now a topic of conversation in the governor's race. Beth Walker reports that the controversy has state legislatures looking at the matter as well.
Construction is affecting nearly every commuter in Utah, and not just during their drive. News of UDOT paying out millions of dollars in the biggest reconstruction project in Utah history hit homes through almost every news source in Utah. UDOT Executive Director John Nord announced that the reason they reached a settlement was to be able to start the project without a black cloud hanging over their head. Utah Senator Mike Morley is on the Transportation Committee and says UDOT used a ranking system to analyze the three project competitors.
They were bidding an amount. So we have $1.7 billion. What can you give us for $1.7 billion?
Two of the bids came within 1 point of each other. Morley says someone within UDOT leaked to Flatiron that they won the project. However,
every single change and repricing on the project came in to the benefit of Provo River constructors.
Morley says UDOT settled with Flatiron for $13.1 million. Utah Senator John Valentine says he believes UDOT should not be able to make settlements of that size.
$13 million under anybody's estimate is too large without coming back to the governor or to the legislature.
When the legislature convenes in January, both Morley and Valentine hope to see several changes in UDOT's bidding process.
It's how we use those limited resources that will define whether we're successful or whether we're like other states and squander those resources.
Beth Grimmett, Election 2010.
Those who responded to the KBYU Utah voter poll were asked to choose whether a statement best described Governor Herbert or Mayor Caroon. A plurality believed that the statement is ethical, best described Gary Herbert, but nearly a third couldn't make up their mind. And David, it seems that there has been a lot of implication that Mayor Caroon even bringing up this issue was mudslinging rather than fact-finding.
We have a low threshold for negative communications in Utah elections. Frankly, we haven't had competitive elections in many cases for a long time. You know, if a Utah voter were to spend a week in any battleground state, they would be shocked. The tone of this campaign has not been unusual. In fact, it's been still fairly low-key by national standards. But it's interesting because I think the Herbert campaign has successfully turned the issue to be one about mudslinging rather than about the question. And for me, the question is, what justified a $13 million payout? I mean, we just don't go around writing $13 million checks to people. It suggests there was something wrong here, and we still don't have the answer to that. I mean, to say that it was in the best interest of the state begs the question for me as a voter and a citizen, why? Why did we make a $13 million mistake, and doesn't somebody need to explain that?
LaVar, Webb, if you were advising Governor Herbert, or perhaps you are a little bit, would you advise him to say more about this or to ignore it past what he's already said?
Politically speaking, and with the election coming up, I think he has handled it very well. And I do think that Mayor Caroon's, I think the issue is legitimate for Caroon to raise the issue and question the $13 million payoff and so forth. But the way he has done it does come across as negative advertising, because, I mean, it's a typical negative advertisement, you know, produced by some out-of-state consultant with a grainy image of Herbert and a scary voice, you know, saying that terrible things have happened. So it does come across as negative campaigning. And I think had Herbert raised the issue without doing that sort of ads, that he would have been better off. I think the polling shows that Herbert has not been hurt with that the immense number of ads that Caroon has been running. He is way ahead in the race and seems to be pulling away further.
Pat Shea, are you surprised that Mayor Caroon is taking a hit for negative advertising? In fact, some of the advertising we see doesn't even have a tagline, "I approve this message," or who. We don't know who it's from.
It has it right at the first.
Does
you
it?
barely see it, because legally they have to put that in. But Caroon doesn't really want to be much associated with it.
Well, I think David hit upon an important topic for people to think about, and that is, what do we mean by civility? Certainly, if you went to any other city or state in an election year, there'd be uncivil behavior by Utah standards. If you go back and read the constitutional debate or the ratification of the Constitution, they certainly were not civil debates. I think the question is, how do you bring up questions about judgment, about management skills, and not be seen as negative? The problem in Utah, in my judgment, is in Sunday, we go to church and we all get positive messages. And then we go through the rest of the 6 days of the week and expect that same kind of positive dialogue to go on. And when you've got an $11 billion budget, it's not all going to be peaches and cream. And so I think we need to make sure voters ask legitimate questions, and we have forums where those questions have to be answered by candidates. The amount of money that is spent on television advertising, I think, is obscene. We need to take that and reopen the question of how do we conduct our elections. And we need to get back to having them in a short period of time and not having to be a millionaire or billionaire to run for public office.
Let's continue now on this theme of ethics. And we're going to bring you a report now from Haley Palfreman, who has found a state house race where there is no incumbent and ethics reform is an issue.
Utahns for Ethical Government is calling for a strict code of ethical conduct which would limit campaign contributions from individuals, stop all contributions from corporations, and prevent candidates from accepting gifts from lobbyists. With the UDOT controversy, this issue is making headlines. But it goes beyond Governor Herbert to the Utah legislative race in House District 63. Republican candidate Dean Sanpay and Democratic candidate Don Jarvis say they both want ethics reform.
As inappropriate things don't happen in the light of day. Inappropriate things happen behind closed doors and in the dark.
Anytime one party has control of a state, you have problems, often with ethics.
Each candidate has a very different plan. Sanpay disagrees with the UEG's proposal, saying there's a better way.
The key, I think, is to get more transparency. It's not to pass statutes that are so restrictive that no one can no longer serve.
But Jarvis stands behind the UEG's proposal and says it will help people see the whole decision-making process.
They do what they want. A lot of their business is conducted behind closed doors in a caucus. Then they open up the doors, and you don't know really what's going on and why they're doing it.
Constitutional Amendment D is on this year's ballot, and if passed, it will establish a 5-member legislative ethics commission that will conduct an independent review of complaints alleging unethical legislative behavior. The UEG sees this amendment as a complementary piece of legislation, but it's looking to put its own initiative on the 2012 ballot. Haley Palfreman, Election 2010.
Question for Pat Shea. Is there any downside for Democratic candidates pushing for ethics reforms in their campaigns this season?
I'd like to see it as apple pie, but I think unfortunately the apples have spoiled because the established order in the legislature is threatened by ethical reform. They would not get the tickets or the trips or whatever else they get for being in their positions of power and responsibility. But I also would extend it, and I think the UDOT is a great example. Just a few years ago, there was an employee there that took a $600,000 bribe from the EnviroCare people and was fired. We need to look carefully at the kind of favors that go on, and we also need to look at the growth rate of Utah government under the Republicans over the last nearly 3 decades now, which has been greater than our population. So all this good management stuff, much of which is true, I think belies the fact that we've been expanding state government at a time when maybe we ought to be cutting it back.
LaVar, why is there such opposition among Republicans to a suggestion of restrictions on campaign donations?
You know, there's one really good way to deal with unethical politicians, and that is vote them out of office. You know, if someone is unethical, then that's what we ought to do with them. The Republicans do support reasonable ethics reform. In fact, the constitutional amendment that was pointed out in that piece was proposed by the Republican legislature, and that will establish an ethics commission constitutionally, so it will be stronger than statute. There are differences of opinion within the party about whether limits ought to be established. I would personally support reasonable limits. I was part of an ethics commission appointed by Governor Huntsman, and we looked through all of these issues very carefully. But I also agree that we ought to immediately report all campaign contributions and expenditures, put them on the internet, let everyone see exactly who's contributing to who, and let that be part of the decision that people make at the voting booth.
One interesting element of the UDOT controversy is that what happened there would be illegal in virtually all states. It's only a handful of states that allow contributions of that amount. Utah has no limits whatsoever. It's the Wild West here in terms of money and politics. Does that pose real problems for Utah going forward, the fact that there are absolutely no constraints?
Well, again, I would support reasonable limits. I do think that this campaign has established whole new levels of campaign contributions where we have people contributing at the $50,000 level. The $87,000 that Pat has referred to was actually a number of individuals and companies, not just one, but they were all part of the team that proposed on the I-15 project. So I do think that reasonable limits ought to be put in place. But again, if people have concerns about that, if they don't like what Governor Herbert has done, the campaign contributions that he has received or accepted, then let that be a factor in the way they make their mind up.
We're down to our last issue now, and by now there is no one who has not heard of the Tea Party. It's a movement.
Here at BYU, we don't do Tea Party.
At least not with caffeine in it. It's a party. It's a movement that's not really a political party, and it doesn't officially endorse candidates, although it takes credit for defeating Senator Bob Bennett at the state Republican convention. Reporter Ashley Masters set out to gauge Tea Party influence in the Utah legislative race.
Local activists support a few Republican candidates that they say have parallel goals for the state.
We're going to get some good people in there this year, and I'm excited about it.
One of the Tea Party approved candidates comes from Legislative District 47. Ken Ivory and John Rendell are vying for a spot in Utah's House of Representatives, and Ivory has the Tea Party's support.
He definitely stands for what the Tea Party people stand for: limited government, controlling and stopping the spending, bringing back the power truly to the states where it belongs, where it started.
Ivory says he's concerned about what kind of world he's leaving to his children, and says limited government and fiscal responsibility will give them a better future.
We have a duty to the rising generation. We have a duty to make sure we leave things better for them than we found them, and we've got a lot of work to do.
Democratic candidate John Rendell did not get the Tea Party support because party activists say he is not addressing the issues that are most important to the American people. Rendell says his campaign emphasizes education, transportation, and fair and reasonable representation.
Now, I don't happen to particularly agree with what the Tea Party's saying and doing, but I fully support their right to do that.
Ashley Masters, Election 2010.
Well, let's take a look at some graphics now in the KBYU voter poll survey. We asked people what sort of impression they have of the Tea Party movement. A majority say they are favorably impressed with the Tea Party. Yet when asked if they are active Tea Party supporters, most said no. Well, let me ask our two panelists here. Pat Shea, do you think the Tea Party movement and its influence over time is a good thing for the Republican Party? I know I should ask LaVar, but I want to ask you as a Democrat.
Well, I think one of the tragedies of the 2010 election cycle is the defeat of Senator Robert Bennett. He was truly, in my judgment, one of the best senators Utah has ever had. He was the third-ranking minority member on the Senate Appropriations Committee. He was respected by both sides of the aisle. And for 3,000 delegates to defeat him so the rest of us don't get a chance to vote is simply not democratic. It's not the way government's supposed to operate. But I also think the Tea Party is much like happened at the turn of the century in England, where there was a Captain Ludd who started leading a populist revolt against industrialization called the Luddites. And they'd go around and smash machines. Well, I think the Tea Party is trying to smash government that has survived for more than 200 years. They're wrong, and they'll eventually come to their sentence.
LaVar, Webb, Mike Lee is very much a Tea Party candidate, having emerged as the nominee from the Republican convention for the U.S. Senate. Do you see the Tea Party as having staying power in the Republican Party and staying power in Utah?
You know, I supported Senator Bennett. I do think that Mike Lee will be a very good senator for Utah, and he will learn and grow and do very well. I don't necessarily consider myself to be part of the Tea Party, but I do have a lot of respect for the Tea Party. I think we have to remember that this is very much a grassroots, bottom-up organization, if you can even call it an organization, because it's so diffuse. There aren't any necessarily national leaders. You can't. Who is the leader of the Tea Party in Utah? You know, nobody knows. And so it really is a very legitimate, heartfelt, grassroots group of people who want to get involved in politics. They're concerned about what is happening nationally and locally, and they are engaged and they're involved, and more people ought to be that way. And so I do have a lot of respect for them. I do think that they're going to have a big impact this year, and time will tell, I guess, whether that continues on into the future.
Well, we've reached the end of our hour. It's gone very quickly, and we want to thank Pat Shea and LaVar Webb for being with us for this program, and David Magleby, Dean David Magleby. It's always a pleasure
to be with you, Wes.
A pleasure to hear your insights, and a reminder that early voting is underway, and next Friday at 8 p.m. we'll be hearing from candidates in Utah's 2nd Congressional District. Thank you for joining us. I'm Wes Sims. Good night, everyone.